The river froze before the sky even turned gray. Not just a skin of frost, but thick, groaning ice that cracked loud enough to wake the dogs. By mid-morning, the wind had gone knife-blade sharp, and the first colt was dead, hooves curled, eyes frozen open like it had seen something it didn't understand. The other horses stood in a tight cluster behind the slatted barn, noses buried in each other's manes, steam rising from their flanks only to vanish before it got high enough to matter. Eli McGraw didn't run. He didn't rush like the rest of the valley hands who'd suddenly remembered winter was real. He moved slow, deliberate, the way you do when you've seen weather like this before and know there's no rushing it. His hat brim was crusted with snow, and his coat made no sound except the crunch of frost against the elbow seams. He walked the line of his paddock, eyes scanning every fence post, every drift. He saw Charlie Jenkins' wagon rumble past on the ridge, piled high, with tarps and salted hay, a trail of smoke swirling from the saddlebag stove they'd bolted to the bed. Desperate measures. Eli didn't wave. Charlie didn't look down. When Eli opened the barn door, it wasn't to a stall or a hayloft. It was to something they'd all laughed at 6 weeks ago. Some had called it an ark. Others said it looked like a blacksmith shop built backwards. It stood low to the ground, built like a bunker with no windows, just staggered slats angled to trap warmth and cut wind. The roof was half sod, half tar-sealed planks, and buried beneath the base layer was something no one else had thought to add. A trench system that ran the length of the barn, lined with stone and packed with buried clay pots. He'd built it himself. Took him 3 months, more time than most spent on their own homes. He missed harvest helping it come together. People noticed. One neighbor even said, "Ain't no horse worth that much dirt work, McGraw." Eli had nodded and gone back to digging. Inside, the shelter breathed warm air like a sleeping animal. The logs hadn't frosted, the floor hadn't iced, and the water buckets hadn't frozen solid like the ones outside that cracked like broken bells when you tapped them. The horses shuffled in, heads low, steam curling from their nostrils. They didn't whinny. They didn't panic. It was like they knew. Outside, the snow deepened. The wind howled against the valley walls and came back sharper. A ranch hand from 3 properties down was seen later trying to burn fence rails to keep his last 2 horses from seizing up. Another had lost his team outright. But Eli's horses were inside, not just alive but warm. And by morning the rumors had started. There's a cowboy up in the ridge barn whose herd didn't freeze, but no one knew yet what he'd really done, or how many it would end up saving. They called him the crazy one, said no man should work that long on a barn, especially not for animals. Some joked he was building a chapel for horses. Others said it was proof Eli McGraw had gone soft since his brother died in that blizzard 2 years back. But nobody said it to his face. Eli was the kind of man you didn't cross without reason, and even when folks thought he was wasting time, they still respected the way he moved, measured, like everything he did, had already been tested in his head a dozen times before his hands ever touched a tool. The shelter had started small, just a sketch on a sheet of feed paper, pinned to the back wall of his cabin next to the old map of cattle routes. He'd drawn it after a snow squall in March that had taken down 2 colts from exposure, even though they'd been bedded in straw and wrapped in blankets. That kind of death stuck with a man silent, unnecessary, stupid. So that spring, when others were repairing fences and reseeding pasture, Eli was hauling stones from the riverbank and digging a perimeter trench 2 feet deep and 1 foot wide. Too deep for a stable, they said, too narrow for a root cellar. Eli didn't answer. He laid the first log in April. Each one was stripped and dried, no bark, no moss. He used dovetail joints instead of saddle notches, more work, but tighter. He didn't build up, he built down. The shelter was sunk a foot below ground level, then lined with double walls, inner logs sealed tight with clay and horsehair chinking, and outer logs braced with sandbags that he poured and stacked by hand. Between those layers he packed sawdust and straw, and between that he buried fire bricks that would later hold heat from iron kettles of embers tucked in stone-lined vents. The roof sloped like a shallow lean-to, angled just enough to keep snow from piling heavy. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't tall. It didn't even have a proper weather vane. But it held warmth. and it held silence, the kind of silence that horses trust when the wind goes sideways and the cold starts looking for things to claim. Neighbors had stopped by that summer, mostly out of curiosity. Charlie Jenkins spit and said, "Looks like you're building a fortress for nags." Eli wiped sweat from his brow and replied, "I'm building something that doesn't quit when the sky does." Charlie didn't answer. He just walked around the frame, eyed the trench vents and the sod-packed seams, then muttered, "Can't see it lasting. You'd be better off buying coal." When the first frost came in October, no one remembered Eli's barn. They remembered feed prices and the rail line delay. They remembered how late the season had run and how little hay they'd managed to stock. But Eli remembered every sneer, every shake of the head. And when the blizzard struck in early November, weeks ahead of when it should have, his shelter was already stocked, sealed, and humming like a heartbeat. The others lit fires and prayed. Eli just opened the door and let his herd walk in. It wasn't a regular cold. This was a cold that confused the animals and frightened the men. The kind that dropped out of a sky that looked blue until it wasn't. The kind that made smoke freeze in the air like glass thread hanging there for a beat too long before vanishing without warmth. By the third night, the valley knew they were in trouble. By the fifth, the horses started dying. Frost formed on the inside of cabin windows. Firewood stacks shrank faster than men could chop. Lantern oil burned out twice as fast and gave off half the light. In some barns, men tried setting up stoves next to stalls, hoping the cast iron would warm the air. All it did was bake the horses on one side and leave the other frozen stiff. One rancher tried hanging canvas sheets to trap heat. It only caught smoke and panic. The horses in those barns coughed for days, then stopped making noise altogether. But not Eli's. His shelter didn't smoke. It breathed. The slats on the south side angled just enough let the warm air escape while pulling clean air through the floor vents he'd cut in early July. The fire pits below, packed with slow-burning straw and wrapped in stones, glowed like old embers inside a hearth. Above them, a row of hollow clay pipes ran beneath the bedding, warming the floor like a poor man's furnace. The horses shifted their weight, laid down, slept. Word started spreading. First it was just a whisper. McGraw's horses ain't coughing. Then it turned to skepticism. He probably boarded 'em out east. But then someone saw it. Smoke rising slow and steady from a squat structure halfway buried in snow. No black trail, no stutter. Just a low plume, barely visible, shaped by air that knew exactly where to go. Charlie Jenkins came riding up on the sixth day, face red from windburn, eyes wild. He didn't dismount, just shouted, "You got room!" Eli pointed. Charlie didn't say thank you. He just slid off and led his horses inside. Their breath was shallow. One mare's flanks were trembling from the inside out. Eli knelt by the nearest fire pit and added another handful of dry hay to the embers. The warmth spread slowly, radiating outward through stone and earth. The horses stood still. Then, one by one, they exhaled. Long and deep, like a burden had been lifted. Outside, the snow deepened. Blankets hung over cabin windows in town. Folks started burning furniture. Inside Eli's shelter, a horse whinnied not in fear, but in comfort. The storm wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But the wind had finally found something it couldn't touch. Nobody asked about the floor, not at first. They were too busy noticing the roof or the way the snow seemed to slide off the walls without piling. Some stared at the odd angle of the slats or the sawdust-packed seams and called it strange, but the real secret wasn't above, it was below. The fire trick wasn't fire, not like most understood it. Eli hadn't built a stove. He hadn't run pipe from his cabin or rigged up some miracle coal furnace. What he'd done was older, quieter, smarter. Something he'd learned not from a book, but from a retired cavalry farrier in Kansas who'd once kept an entire stable warm through a Missouri siege, using nothing more than straw, stones, and buried breath. Eli had built it from the ground up, literally. Before the shelter walls ever rose, he dug trenches thin and shallow 2 feet down, 4 feet apart. Into those, he set clay pots the size of dinner basins. He'd packed the bottoms with sand, then layered straw, old hay, and coals lit just once and allowed to smolder. The pots were capped with flat stones, and the heat didn't rise fast. It crept, moved through the earth like a warm river under frozen soil, slow and constant. Above them, Eli laid thick timber planks, notched tight, covered with dried grass and fresh bedding. The floor never steamed, it never smoked. But when you placed your bare hand on the planks, held it there, you could feel it, gentle, bone-deep warmth, the kind that didn't scorch, just stayed. That was what saved the horses. Cold rises from the ground. Most barns couldn't stop it. Even the best insulated walls failed if the floor was ice. Eli understood that. He didn't just warm the air, he warmed the bones, the joints, the hooves, and the air above followed suit. Charlie Jenkins figured it out first. He was sitting against the far wall, watching his stallion finally lie down for the first time in days. He placed a gloved hand on the wood and frowned. Then he pulled the glove off and touched it again. His mouth didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there for an hour longer than he planned. By morning, 3 more ranchers had come. One dragging a colt half dead from frostbite. Another bringing his only 2 mares left alive. None of them said much. They brought their horses in. They fed them from Eli's stock. They leaned against the walls and didn't speak of the wind, and slowly they began to notice. The shelter didn't roar with heat, it hummed. It didn't reek of smoke or singe the nose with ash. It was warm like a body, like a hand held close. They looked at Eli, at the packed floor and the steady breath of horses that should have been dead, and realized this wasn't luck. This was built. They came dragging behind a broken wagon, hooves crusted in frost, tails limp with ice. The mares had gone 3 nights without shelter, and now their legs trembled with every step. Their breath came shallow, curling into mist that froze in the air before falling like ash. Behind them, hunched beneath a torn blanket, was an old man named Corwin Tate, grizzled, stubborn, and one of the last in the valley to believe a horse could outlast a storm with just hay and hope. He didn't knock, didn't even dismount. He just looked at Eli, eyes hollow. "You got room?" Eli walked out into the snow and studied the mares. One was stumbling. The other had blood on her back leg where the hide had split from cold. Corwin looked down. "They won't make it," he muttered. "Vet said so yesterday. Said if they'd been inside a week ago, maybe, but now?" He trailed off. Eli nodded once. "Bring 'em in." Inside, the shelter pulsed with life. The air was heavy with horse sweat and hay dust, the kind of heat that softened the chest and thawed fingers without scalding. The horses already inside barely looked up, some standing, some lying down, steam rising off their flanks. The scent of warm oats and pine sap drifted in waves. Corwin led the mares in slow, one hand on each lead rope. The second one collapsed just past the threshold. Eli didn't flinch. He rolled blankets under her body, piled straw against her ribs, and laid a hot stone wrapped in burlap beneath her stomach. The old methods. "I don't want to watch them die," Corwin said. "Then go outside," Eli replied, without cruelty. He stayed anyway. That night, they boiled oats in a black kettle hung from the iron hook in the corner, ladled mash into wooden bowls, and spoon-fed it to the sick mares. One of them tried to stand too soon. The other simply breathed, and that was enough. Eli sat beside them through the night, checking coals, turning stones, replacing the pots beneath the floor with fresh embers. He said nothing. He didn't sleep. And by morning, when the wind outside screamed like something living and mad, the mares were still breathing. Their ears twitched. Corwin didn't believe it at first. "She should have seized. That leg was—" He stopped. The mare had blinked. "You see it?" he asked. Eli only said, "She's not done yet." Corwin turned toward him, slow. "I didn't believe you. Not till now. I thought you were just hiding in here, playing at something." Eli looked around the shelter at the glow of firestones, the breath of 12 horses rising. In unison, the warmth that came not from luck, but from design. "I wasn't hiding," he said. "I was building the only place in this valley that remembers how to breathe." The idea didn't come from a book, or a blueprint, or some newfangled invention from back east. It came from a man half drunk on peach brandy in a saloon in Fort Scott. Eli had been 21 at the time, just another green cowboy hauling feed and scraping pennies for a saddle of his own. The man had a scar down his neck and a cough that sounded like wet gravel, and when the talk turned to Winters, he leaned forward and said, "You ever hear of the trench barns they used in Tennessee? Kept horses alive when the men didn't even have boots." Eli didn't say a word, just listened. The soldier told a story about the siege of Fort Donelson, about snow that fell for 7 straight days, and how their horses would have died if it weren't for a Confederate scout who taught them to build down, not up. He'd made a trench stable, roofed with branches and clay, and packed it with earth and smoldering coals from field ovens. The heat trapped in the ground kept 20 cavalry horses breathing while the rest of the camp froze stiff. The story stuck with Eli, not because it was dramatic, but because it made sense, not a miracle. Not a hero tale. Just smart, desperate men refusing to let cold have the last word. Years later, when the frostbite killed 2 of his own colts, he remembered that story. And so, he began sketching. Digging, planning. He took the basic idea and reworked it for the prairie. Deeper trenches, wider base, real insulation. Instead of saplings and canvas, he used hardwoods and sod. Instead of wet clay, he packed the seams with crushed limestone and horsehair from last spring's shearing. And instead of hoping it worked, he tested every part, lit fires inside during autumn, sat in the dark and watched how smoke curled, how air moved, how heat stayed or fled. He tracked frost on the beams. He counted seconds between coals and warmth. And when he saw what worked, he made more. 12 stalls, each angled slightly to catch radiant heat from the trench lines. Overhead, he installed a simple pulley vent system, nothing fancy, just rope and board, but enough to release pressure when things got too thick. The walls were reinforced with vertical beams sunk 4 feet deep, packed with gravel, and sealed with tar pitch. It wasn't just a barn, it was a machine. A breathing organism, built for stillness, made to fight what men couldn't. And now, in the dead heart of winter, it was doing just that. The ranchers started asking questions, not mocking anymore. How deep were the floor trenches? What kind of stone held the longest heat? Where had he gotten the idea? Eli didn't tell them about the saloon or the scarred soldier. He just said, "It's old knowledge. We just forgot to keep it." And in that moment, they understood something they hadn't before. Eli hadn't built this shelter for this winter. He'd built it for the one no one thought would ever come. They came without pride. Faces chapped, eyes red. Not a word about the things they'd said in September or the laughter that followed every time Eli hauled another sack of sawdust past the livery. No one mentioned the names they'd called him, the stable priest, the ditch digger, McGraw the mule whisperer. That was all gone now, burned off like fog under noon sun, because now they had horses dying on their feet and nothing left but wind-burned hands and desperation. The first was May Henderson. She'd never liked Eli. Said once she'd rather keep her animals close to God's breath, whatever that meant. But now she was cradling the lead rope of her only mare like a child, whispering into the animal's ear as if she could bargain with the cold. "I don't care if it's full," she said before she even reached the gate. "I'll sit outside. Just let her rest where it's warm." Eli opened the door. Didn't say a word. Just pointed to an empty stall near the rear wall closest to the main trench, where the warmth settled slow and deep. May led the mare inside. The horse didn't fight. It folded onto the straw like it had known this place its whole life. After May, others followed. Sam Rourke brought a gelding with a cracked hoof wrapped in burlap. The Langston brothers came with a wagon load of colts, 2 already gone stiff before dawn. Even Charlie Jenkins returned, this time with rope burns on his palms from dragging a draft team over 6 miles of crusted snow. Each man walked in with the same look, half shame, half prayer. Eli didn't turn anyone away. They packed the shelter wall to wall, 14 horses by midday, 20 by sunset. Eli doubled the fire pits and split more stones, opening his last barrel of Kyline-fired bricks stored behind the root cellar. The older ranchers started helping without being asked. Corwin fed the fires. Charlie adjusted the slats to redirect the drafts. May, silent but sharp-eyed, brushed down every horse that entered. No one argued. No one joked. They worked. Outside, the storm deepened. Town was down to burning fence posts and barn doors. The vet had stopped making rounds. Feed prices jumped 60% if you could find any to buy. But inside the shelter, something else had taken root. Not just survival, not just warmth, something closer to reverence. One by one, the newcomers started whispering things like, "I didn't know you could hold heat in stone that long. How'd you learn to bury the coals like that? Where'd you get the idea for the breathing slats?" And Eli, quiet as ever, would just answer, "I built what I wanted to walk into when things got bad. It wasn't humble, it wasn't arrogant, it was the truth." And by morning, there were 22 horses still breathing in a valley where half the barns now stood cold and empty. Most cowboys thought warmth came from blankets. Or hay. Maybe a tarp draped over the barn door, and a prayer muttered before dawn. That was the extent of it. Keep the animals fed and sheltered, hope the wind passed before the marrow froze. But Eli knew better. He'd watched good horses die with full stomachs. Watched frost creep into their joints, slow their breath, harden their blood. Hay filled bellies. But it didn't keep souls tethered when the temperature dropped below reason. So he built a second kind of feeding, one made of heat, moisture, and stillness. Every few hours, he'd refill the kettles at the base of the shelter walls. Old iron pots, blackened from years of use, packed tight with river stones that held warmth like memory. On top, he poured ladles of water, letting the steam rise slow and silent into the air. Not a roaring furnace, not a blast of heat, just a steady, wet warmth that sank into coats and bone. It kept the air humid enough that lungs didn't seize. It kept the frost from biting too deep. The horses began to move easier. They drank more, ate more, slept longer. Eli watched for signs, a flick of an ear, a softened flank. The kind of details that told you an animal was healing, not surviving, but mending. And he didn't just use fire, he used silence. The shelter was built to muffle wind, to cradle noise. No hammering gusts, no cracking rafters, just breath, and the rustle of hay, and the hiss of water on hot stones. It created a rhythm, a heartbeat. Even the most panicked mares calmed under it. Ranchers started noticing. "That black one he wasn't eating 2 days ago," Sam Rourke said, watching his gelding chew through a feed bag like it owed him something. "He's warm underneath," May whispered, hand against her mare's belly. "Not just surface, deep." They asked Eli how it worked. He crouched beside one of the fire pots, lifted the lid with a bent iron hook, and showed them the layered stone bed beneath. "This here holds heat 6 hours. I rotate the pots in pairs. One cools while the other burns." "And the water?" Corwin asked. "Steam soothes the lungs," Eli said. "Horses breathe better in warm fog than dry cold. So do we." No one argued. They just kept watching. By now, the shelter held 26 horses and a dozen people. Not all of them could sleep at once. Some sat upright, backs against walls, wrapped in saddle blankets and wool. They fed the horses in shifts, stirred the pots, and whispered stories they hadn't told in years. Outside, the storm howled against the valley. Inside, the fire fed them all. And somewhere in the rhythm of water and breath, they began to understand this wasn't a barn, it was a sanctuary. The letter came folded in twine, edges stiff with frost. Delivered by a half-frozen boy on a sway-backed mule, it bore the railroad seal and a line of hurried ink that told the valley what it feared most. No more supply trains. Not this month. Not next. The snowpack had buried the tracks 10 feet deep past Red Elk Pass, and 2 snowplow engines sent to clear the way had vanished into drifts and silence. The railroad was done trying. Town went quiet. No flour, no coffee, no oats for the feed stores. Whatever hadn't been stored by December was now gone. By nightfall, folks were twisting hay into tight, smoky logs to burn in stoves. Some had already started boiling boot leather. But on the ridge, Eli's shelter still breathed. He'd planned for this. Weeks earlier, while others scrambled to stack hay bales, Eli had built a root cellar just off the shelter's rear wall. Dug deep, lined with stone, packed with grain sacks and fire bricks. Ventilated to keep moisture low, sealed with pitch and straw. There were oats, molasses, barley sprigs wrapped in oilcloth. Feed enough for 40 horses, because he'd built it not for the ones he owned, but for the ones he knew would come. That night, a rider came from the far west fields, wagon broken, horse lame, and no hope left. Eli gave him a place by the fire, then handed him a feed sack. By morning, 2 more riders came, then 4, none left. The townspeople held a meeting in the old schoolhouse, breath clouding the air. The mayor spoke first, voice cracked. "McGraw's stable is the only place left with stock and warmth. We'll ration. Ask him to share." Someone muttered, "You want to ask the man we mocked to feed our horses?" But there was no debate. They sent a delegation, 2 women, 1 man, shoulders stooped not from the cold, but from the weight of needing mercy. When they arrived, Eli was setting another pot to boil. 33 horses now, 5 more waiting outside. The shelter was crowded, but not strained. They explained the situation, showed him the letter, told him the trains were done, the stores were empty, and the town's remaining draft teams wouldn't last another week without feed. Eli listened, then walked to the root cellar, pried open the lid, and pointed. "Start with the northern barrels," he said. "Leave the soaked grains for the foals. Everything else split it equal." The woman closest to him swallowed hard. "We'll pay you back." Eli shrugged. "You'll stay alive. That's enough." And just like that, the man they'd laughed at became the man they leaned on. By nightfall, his overbuilt, overprepared, overmocked horse shelter had become the beating heart of the valley. When the snow finally broke in late March, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence. The kind that settles after a battle, when you walk the field and count who made it through. Most barns had fallen in. Fences snapped, dozens of horses gone. But Eli's shelter stood squat and solid on the ridge, dark with soot, warm with life. They came to see it not as skeptics now, but as students. One by one, ranchers and townfolk walked the perimeter, measured the walls, noted the angle of the vents, ran their hands along the seams of clay-chinked logs, asked about sawdust insulation, firestone pots, the trench system, the steam vents, the pulley slat windows. Eli showed them everything. No pride, no sting, just quiet explanation, like a man passing down something that didn't belong to him alone. May Henderson brought her boys and made them copy the structure plank for plank. Sam Rourke redrew the stall layout and planned to build 2 just like it. Even Corwin Tate, stubborn as they came, ordered fresh clay bricks to line a floor he now knew mattered more than the roof. The blueprint spread without ever being drawn. It traveled in stories, in nods, in lines scrawled on feed sacks and smokehouse walls. They called it McGraw's barn, but Eli always shook his head. "It ain't mine," he said. "It belongs to anyone who remembers what cold can do when you ignore it." Some said he was lucky, others said he was paranoid, but every man who stood inside that shelter during the worst storm the plains had seen in 30 years knew the truth. He was ready. Not because he knew this winter would come, but because he'd always built for the one that might. The cabin he called a stable had held 42 horses, 19 people, and a valley's last hope. It never buckled, never smoked out, never failed. And long after the wind was gone and the snow turned to slush, they kept coming. Not for feed, for answers. How deep were the coals buried? What angle did you set the floor vents? What kind of stone held heat best? What would you do different next time? Eli answered every question. The blueprint became more than timber and pitch. It became a reminder. Not every miracle looks like a lightning bolt. Some come quiet, buried deep in the ground, held together by sawdust, patience, and a man willing to build something the world doesn't think it needs until it does. That summer, when the lumber orders came in and the sawmills buzzed, the ridge was alive with new barns. Every single one bore a mark, an angled wall, a trench, a steam pot, a heat stone copied from Eli's design, and this time no one laughed.